Kitakyūshū, Fukuoka Prefecture, Japan. At Kokura Kita police station, an ordinary, quiet day at work is interrupted by the call of an elderly couple who reported a crime that was far from what the local police force was used to dealing with. The couple's teenage granddaughter had been held captive for over 7 years in an apartment just 8 minutes away from the police station. Just the day prior, she had made a daring escape, and despite her trauma, she managed to provide the authorities with the exact location of her former prison. And sure enough, when police arrived at the scene of the crime, they found the two culprits. To their surprise, they were an unassuming-looking, middle-aged couple that, at least at first glance, seemed completely ordinary, harmless even. But when a couple was arrested and taken in for questioning, that first impression quickly faded away. They refused to speak, didn't state their names, their IDs turned out to be fake. And overall, there was an unsettling atmosphere surrounding them, almost as if they were concealing something far more sinister than a kidnapping. And sure enough, the police would soon discover that this wasn't merely a case of abduction and imprisonment. Instead, what they had stumbled upon here was a horrifying serial murder case. Over the past 8 years, the couple, soon identified as 40-year-old Matsunaga Futoshi and Ogata Junko, had orchestrated the deaths of at least 7 people, 6 of which were part of Ogata Junko's own family. Between December of 1997 and June of 1998, the prestigious Ogata family, a wealthy and well-respected family in their local community, was drawn into a nightmarish ordeal inside the very same Kokura apartment that served as the prison of the kidnapped teenager. Here, 3 generations of the Ogata family were imprisoned, tortured, and ultimately murdered, one by one. And here's perhaps the most disturbing part of the story. All this torturing and killing, the members of the Ogata family committed against each other, all at the command of Matsunaga Futoshi, a man who somehow was able to transform the once prestigious Ogata family into what could only be described as his very own personal cult that blindly followed his every command. But here's the thing. What unfolded inside the Kokura apartment between December of 97 and June of 98 was actually just the climax of a long, deadly career that later earned Matsunaga Futoshi nicknames like the Mind Control Killer, a name derived from his unique method of operation, manipulating others into doing his dirty work, which allowed him to orchestrate nearly 2 decades of heinous crimes, all without ever laying a hand on his victims himself. It's this unique ability to control and exploit his victims that makes Matsunaga Futoshi's story one of the most unique and unsettling in Japanese crime history. His level of manipulation is so extraordinary that it often seems impossible to comprehend or even explain. And yet, I would like to at least try to explain it, and to do that, we will take a journey through the life of Matsunaga Futoshi. His early childhood, his transformation into one of the most manipulative criminals that Japan has ever seen, and of course his weird, unusual, and toxic relationship with Ogata Junko, his perfect partner in crime, the Bonnie to his Clyde, and as you will see, a critical piece of the puzzle behind his murderous legacy. This is the story of Matsunaga Futoshi, Japan's mind control killer. Born in Kitakyūshū's Kokura Kita ward, Matsunaga Futoshi was raised in a house that doubled as a successful store selling tatami mats. Business was going smoothly, and so the Matsunagas were in a position to give their beloved son everything he desired. Overall, it is said that Futoshi had an incredibly spoiled childhood, and when he was 7 years old, the family relocated to Yanagawa, a city on the opposite side of Fukuoka Prefecture, where Futoshi's father was set to take over his father's futon business. And it was also here that Matsunaga would spend almost the entirety of his school years. In school, he immediately managed to stand out. He excelled academically, consistently ranking among the top students in his class, and by the time he entered junior high, he had already established himself as a leader, serving as class president and even becoming the captain of several school activity clubs, beating out much older students to claim the position. Futoshi was well liked by his peers, popular with girls thanks to his good looks, and on the surface, he seemed like the kind of student who was destined for great things. You know, classic serial killer material. Unironically. Though while Futoshi seemed to have a bright future ahead of him, there was another side to his personality that hinted at trouble. Because compared to what his fellow students thought of him, he gained a reputation among teachers as a rule breaker and habitual liar. His antics were relatively minor at first, but things then quickly took a darker turn starting during his high school years. It was then that Futoshi was caught engaging in inappropriate sexual behavior with a junior high school student, which ultimately landed him a transfer to an all-boys school. In hindsight, it is easy to view this as some kind of troubling sign of things to come. But for the time being, he managed to graduate, got married at the young age of 19, and even had a child the following year, before taking over his father's futon business, which he named World, or World. By 1985, age 24, Matsunaga Futoshi appeared to be living the dream. He had a wife, a child, and his very own seemingly thriving business. To his former classmates, he must have been the source of envy, a handsome, young, and prosperous man. But what no one knew at the time was that at this point, Matsunaga's dark side had already been fully in play. Despite being married, he carried on numerous affairs, reportedly with around 10 different women in total. But since Tinder and co. were a good 3 decades away, Matsunaga relied on more traditional methods in order to track down one extramarital partner after another. His strategy? Scour the photos in his old high school yearbook for girls he found attractive, and give them a call. And it was during one of these searches for his next conquests that he came across Ogata Junko, the woman who would end up becoming his partner in crime for the following 2 decades. Ogata Junko was born in 1962 into a family of wealthy farmers from Kurume, Fukuoka Prefecture, which owned a significant amount of land, and enjoyed a very high social standing in their local community. Back then, the Ogatas could almost be considered celebrities in Kurume. Although Ogata Junko and Matsunaga Futoshi attended the same junior high school, they never actually interacted with each other as students. However, in 1980, when Matsunaga spotted her picture in his yearbook, he wasted no time in reaching out to her. And as fate would have it, Junko was in a vulnerable position at the time and desperately needed someone to talk to. After graduating from junior college, Junko worked as a kindergarten teacher. One day, a child in her care had a minor accident, an unfortunate but not uncommon occurrence, sure. Problem was, this child's father belonged to a local Yakuza gang, and so what might have been a small incident in most other cases turned into a nightmare for Junko. The gangsters began harassing and intimidating her relentlessly, and Matsunaga, ever the opportunist, saw this as his chance. He played the role of the savior, lending her a sympathetic ear and promising to protect her. He boasted about a successful business and reassured her that he could shield her from any and all harm. His calculated manipulation worked, and as time went on, Junko became increasingly dependent on him, just like he wanted. Eventually, she agreed to an affair with Matsunaga, an affair that transformed into a relationship that lasted way longer than his actual marriage. Initially, this relationship seemed ordinary enough, or as ordinary as an affair can be, but things soon took a sinister turn. One day, Junko casually mentioned a story involving her ex-boyfriend, and it was then that Matsunaga's true nature surfaced. His jealousy spiraled into violent and abusive behavior, and from that point on, he constantly accused her of infidelity, physically assaulted her, and demanded complete control over her life. He forced Junko to hand over her diaries, punishing her if he read anything he disliked. In one particularly horrific act, he made her brand the kanji of his first name into her skin with a burning cigarette. And that is how what began as an affair turned into something much darker. Gradually, and through relentless abuse, Matsunaga shattered Junko's spirit, breaking her down and molding her into a submissive tool for his future schemes. Junko's parents sensed very early on that something was wrong. From the very beginning, they vehemently opposed her involvement with Matsunaga, knowing he was a married man and already suspecting that he was mistreating their daughter. But as always, Matsunaga's manipulative charm won out. During a visit to the Ogata family home, he convinced Junko's father that he was a trustworthy and respectable match for her, playing the part of a polite young man with ease. A far cry from the monster he truly was. Matsunaga's company perfectly mirrored his personality too. Because behind the facade of World, his seemingly successful futon business, Matsunaga was running elaborate schemes that allowed him to swindle employees, customers, and businessmen out of an astonishing 180 million yen over the course of 7 years, starting in the mid-1980s. In short, World was primarily a front for Matsunaga's fraud and blackmail operations. But for the company's handful of employees, World represented the closest thing to hell. A detailed interview with an ex-employee of World, published by Bunshun in September of 2024, revealed the extent of Matsunaga's cruelty during this period. He frequently abused his staff, but true to form, rarely got his own hands dirty to do so. Instead, he forces employees to physically harm one another with punches and kicks if they did something wrong or didn't meet their quota, creating a hostile atmosphere between his employees that he used to exert psychological control. Meanwhile, claims about his supposed connections to organized crime made it clear that escape was not an option. His sadistic tendencies grew and grew, and eventually, Matsunaga began seeking more extreme methods of control and punishment. The physical beatings had quickly become part of an average workday at World headquarters. But after a while, even that wasn't enough to satisfy Matsunaga's growing appetite for cruelty. And that is when he discovered what would later become by far his favorite way of torturing his victims: electrocution. By using an exposed electric wire, Matsunaga made his employees use electric shocks on each other, applying electricity to their hands, feet, forehead, even their private parts. The ex-employee interviewed by Bunshun estimates that he was tortured this way around 100 times during his time at World, and also stated that the shocks hurt way more than the punches and kicks that they had received on a regular basis. For Matsunaga, who watched with pleasure as his employees tortured each other at his command, it was all about solidifying his role as a manipulative, sadistic tyrant, a chilling precursor to the horrors he would orchestrate just a few years down the line. The horrors that unfolded at World beginning in 1985 only came to an end 7 years later, in 1992, when the authorities, alerted by employees who finally had enough of Matsunaga's tyranny, placed him on a most wanted list. Forced to shut down the company, Matsunaga also divorced his wife of 12 years that same year. But even with his company shut down, his wife divorced, and the law on his heels, he still had Ogata Junko, his loyal and obedient follower who had been working under him as a clerk at World for the past several years. By 1992, Junko was a completely transformed person. Years of physical and emotional abuse had left her deeply scarred, mentally and physically. After a failed attempt to end her own life back in 1985, she quit her job as a kindergarten teacher, left her family home, cut ties with all her friends, and became utterly subordinate to Matsunaga. Together, the pair was now on the run, leaving World behind and fleeing to Ishikawa Prefecture, to evade the law. At this point, Matsunaga could be described as many things: a blackmailer, an abusive boyfriend, a violent boss, and now a wanted man. But his transformation into a ruthless serial killer didn't begin until the following year. In January of '93, while still on the run from the police, Junko gave birth to her and Matsunaga Futoshi's first child. The timing honestly couldn't have been much worse. Not only were they desperately trying to stay under the radar, but their funds from years of fraud and blackmail were starting to dry up. Matsunaga's solution? Keep doing what he did best: manipulate and exploit innocent people. He reconnected with a former lover, using his charm to promise her a marriage and a new life together with her 3 children. It worked. Believing that Junko was Matsunaga's sister, she actually took her 3 kids, left her husband, and stayed with Matsunaga, who convinced her to hand over nearly 10 million yen over the following months. Of course, her financial resources dried up eventually, and in March of 1994, the dead body of the woman and one of her 3 children was discovered in Ogata Prefecture's Beppu Bay. Matsunaga was never proven to be responsible for their deaths, but seeing how extorting money out of people and then disposing of them as soon as they had nothing left to give would later become his trademark pattern, it's hard to imagine otherwise. With that particular scheme exhausted, Matsunaga and Junko were forced to hunt for their next target, which they found in Toraya Kumio, Matsunaga's former classmate who at the time lived together with his 10-year-old daughter. The couple had returned to Kitakyūshū in late 1993, under the guise of reconnecting with Toraya as business partners. But of course, their true intentions were of an entirely different nature. Matsunaga began taking Toraya out for drinks daily, gaining his trust and convincing him to become a co-investor in a business venture. That was of course completely fictitious. Furthermore, Toraya was also persuaded into renting an apartment in Kitakyūshū's Kokura area, meant to serve as the quote-unquote company's office. Meanwhile, Junko's background as a kindergarten teacher was used to get Toraya to entrust him with the care of his 10-year-old daughter. With Toraya's young daughter in his care and her father's trust gained, Matsunaga played his cruelest card yet. Over a couple drinks, Toraya had confided in Matsunaga about past crimes he had committed. Nothing career-ending, but certainly enough for Matsunaga to exploit. Matsunaga coerced Toraya into signing a document confessing to those crimes and fabricating others that he had actually never committed. Matsunaga's promise was to keep his mouth shut, but only in exchange for Toraya's complete obedience. From that moment on, Toraya was trapped. Matsunaga drained Toraya financially, forced him to quit his real estate job in February of 1995, imprisoned him and his daughter in the Kokura apartment, and had Junko monitor them throughout the day. Toraya was forced to commit fully to fulfilling Matsunaga's extortionate demands, taking out loans and borrowing vast amounts of money from family and friends, all of which was then of course handed over to Matsunaga. Once Toraya's funds had dried up, Matsunaga turned his attention to yet another woman, again deceiving her with promises of marriage. Incredibly, it worked again, and she too was imprisoned in a Kokura apartment where Matsunaga managed to squeeze more than 5 million yen out of her. Fortunately, this woman actually managed to escape by bravely leaping off the second-floor balcony of the apartment in March of 1996. Toraya wasn't as fortunate. Over the course of 13 excruciating months, he lived in a Kokura apartment under constant abuse and torture, with Matsunaga reviving his old obsession with electrocution that he had developed back during his days at World. He would punish Toraya for the smallest infractions. If he failed to finish a meal within 10 minutes, he was electrocuted. Forced to stand upright or in painful positions for extended periods, he was shocked if he moved even an inch. He was made to sleep in the freezing cold without bedding and was forced to consume his own vomit and waste when his body failed him. And as horrifying as Toraya's ordeal was, his young daughter's suffering was just as unimaginable. Subjected to manipulation and abuse herself, she was forced to witness her father's slow decline, and in February of 1996, when Toraya was close to dying, Matsunaga took his cruelty to a new level. He made the young girl bite her father's body so hard that it left marks, and then used it to manipulate the young girl for years to come by claiming that it was her fault that he couldn't take her father to the hospital, since the teeth impressions would immediately identify her as the killer. Then, when Toraya Kumio finally succumbed to his injuries on February 26, 1996, Matsunaga ordered the girl to help Junko dispose of the body. Together, they dismembered it using knives, saws, and blenders, boiled the remains in pots, and then disposed of them in the ocean and down the toilet. With that, Toraya Kumio was gone, but the Kokura apartment would become the site of even darker atrocities very soon. Matsunaga Futoshi was now responsible for orchestrating at least one murder, manipulating the victim's now 11-year-old daughter and his long-term partner Junko into doing the dirty work for him. For the young girl, the trauma of her father's murder and her forced involvement in disposing of his body was obviously unimaginable. But even worse still, she would spend the next 6 years trapped inside the Kokura apartment, all while having to endure the guilt and fear that Matsunaga had cruelly instilled in her. Junko found herself in a similar situation, and after having suffered through more than a decade of abuse and manipulation, she finally attempted to escape in April of 1997. By then, she had started working as a hostess in Yuzu in Oita Prefecture, and one day she seized an opportunity to flee Matsunaga's grasp. Of course, she didn't know it at the time, but sadly, her effort to find freedom only resulted in dragging her entire family into what was going on at the Kokura apartment. When Matsunaga discovered that Junko had escaped, he acted swiftly. By exploiting the Ogata family's fear of public scandal and the potential damage to their high social standing if Junko's past crimes were ever to be revealed, he manipulated them into aiding his upcoming scheme. Together, they fabricated a story and spread a rumor about Matsunaga's supposed death and upcoming funeral. And believing that her nightmare was finally over, Junko returned to Kokura only to find Matsunaga alive, furious, and even more controlling than ever before. With her dreams of ever escaping into a normal life utterly shattered, Junko once again fully submitted to Matsunaga's control, even as it became clear that his next plan was to systematically exploit and then destroy her own family. In total, 6 members of the Ogata family were now about to fall into Matsunaga's manipulative trap. Junko's mother, Shizumi, and her husband Takashige, Junko's younger sister, Rieko, and her husband, Kazuya, and their 2 young children, Aya and Yuki, 10 and 5 years old respectively. By shamelessly exploiting each family member's vulnerabilities, Matsunaga methodically manipulated and controlled them like puppets on a string. And where weaknesses didn't already exist, he made sure to manufacture them. Ogata Takashige's fear of public scandal or his family's reputation made him an easy target. Matsunaga also blackmailed him by implicating him in the murder of Toraya Kumio, forcing him to replace the apartment's pipes that still contained traces of the crime that his daughter had been involved in, giving Matsunaga significant leverage over him. Junko's mother, Shizumi, had actually been under Matsunaga's influence for many years already, and for good reason. Since all the way back in 1985, she had been involved in a physical relationship with Matsunaga that may not have been entirely consensual. It was also still a secret at this point, and Shizumi's wish to keep it that way made her yet another easy victim. And just like her mother, Junko's younger sister Rieko had also been involved in a secret physical relationship with Matsunaga. This allowed him to not only manipulate her, but also to sow distrust in her marriage to Kazuya. Kazuya had actually long suspected his wife's infidelity. Matsunaga exploited this by pretending to be his confidant, and by exploiting an inheritance dispute between Kazuya and his father-in-law Takashige, he further fueled Kazuya's resentment towards not only Rieko, but towards the rest of the Ogata family as well. To top it all off, Matsunaga also implicated Kazuya in the murder of Toreya Kumio by having him help repaint the apartment's tiles that could have served as evidence. As for the youngest members of the Ogata family, Aya and Yuki, their only weakness was their young age, and Matsunaga didn't shy away from manipulating their youthful innocence and impressionability to involve them in his horrific plans too. I think you will agree with me that by any standard, what Matsunaga and Junko had done up until this point was already horrifying enough. You know, the abuse of employees at World, the gruesome murder of Toreya Kumio involving his own young daughter. It's all beyond sick and twisted. But what truly sets the Kitakyūshū murders apart, and what makes them so disturbingly unique, is what happened next. Because even when you consider all the tools Matsunaga had at his disposal to manipulate and exploit the Ogata family, the secret relationships, the blackmail, their involvement in covering up Toreya's murder, their actions and choices from this point forward still seem somewhat incomprehensible. It just makes you wonder, how could anyone agree to this, and why did no one ever just come to their senses and realize the horrible things they were doing? Now, before the actual murders began, Matsunaga obviously drained the Ogata family's bank accounts while subjecting them to relentless torture. Except for the youngest family member, the 5-year-old Yuki, everyone else, including the 10-year-old Aya, had to endure Matsunaga's preferred electrocution method, while the adults in the family were desperately scrambling to gather money for him. Takashige took out several loans. His wife Shizumi borrowed large sums of money from acquaintances. Rieko and Kazuya actually resigned from their jobs, handing over their severance pay to Matsunaga. Once Matsunaga deemed someone to be no longer useful, or rather, when they could no longer generate any money for him, he decided it was time to dispose of them. But you already know that he didn't actually do that himself. Just like what happened at World years earlier, where he manipulated his employees to torment each other at his command, Matsunaga was merely there to orchestrate the Ogata family's actions, turning them into his executioners. The first victim of Matsunaga's twisted game would be Takashige. By December 21st, 1997, he had finally run out of ways to make money. And so, Matsunaga tasked Junko to repeatedly electrocute her own father until eventually his body simply couldn't take it anymore. Ogata Takashige died at the age of 61. Takashige's beloved wife Shizumi was next. After not only having to witness her husband's death, but also being forced to participate in the disposal of his body, Shizumi's mental health had deteriorated severely. She spoke in strange voices and appeared to have completely lost touch with reality. But it was her loud screams during the electrocution sessions that eventually prompted Matsunaga to decide that her time was over. He commanded Rieko and her husband Kazuya to strangle her on January 20th, 1998. Rieko's own death followed just a couple of weeks later on February 10th, 1998. At that point, her physical and mental state had already declined rapidly, the repeated torture rendering her nearly deaf. Following Matsunaga's orders, her husband Kazuya, already manipulated into resenting her, ended her life. But to make matters even worse, their 10-year-old daughter Aya was forced to hold her mother down, as her father killed her. Kazuya, after having committed 2 murders under Matsunaga's control, was physically and emotionally exhausted to the point where death might actually have seemed like an escape more than anything. But tragically, his end was slow and agonizing. Following the death of Rieko, Matsunaga confined Kazuya to the bathroom, where he survived for over 2 months by drinking toilet water, before finally succumbing on April 13th, 1998. Aya and Yuki were now the only surviving members of the Ogata family, apart from Junko. Aya begged Matsunaga to let her and her brother go home, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. Instead, Matsunaga forced the 10-year-old to kill her 5-year-old brother on May 17th, 1998, with Junko assisting in the act. Then, just a few weeks later, on June 7th, 1998, Matsunaga ordered Junko to kill Aya, completing the annihilation of the Ogata family. Over the course of just 7 months, almost an entire family had been destroyed, not by Matsunaga's own hands, but by each other under his control. What happened in that apartment between December of 1997 and June of 1998 is truly just as horrifying as it is incomprehensible. I mean, sure, Matsunaga had an extraordinary ability to manipulate and exploit people's vulnerabilities. But how did he manage to transform a wealthy, respected family into his own personal cult, willing to simply follow his every twisted command? I can understand how years of abuse completely broke Junko's will, or how fear could force young children into submission. But what about the adults? How come no one ever took a chance to finally put an end to Matsunaga's tyranny? Whatever the answer to that question may be, and I'm sure there is a logical answer, the facts remain. With the help of Ogata Junko, Matsunaga Futoshi had achieved exactly what he set out to do, and they might actually have been able to escape justice entirely, if it wasn't for that one brave girl that they had kept alive inside the Kokura apartment all this time. As you'll recall, Toraya Kumio's daughter, who by the way never had her name publicly revealed, had been held captive by Matsunaga and Junko since all the way back in late 1994. She had endured the unimaginable, witnessing and even being coerced into participating in her father's murder, living through the horrors that befell the Ogata family, and enduring years of physical and emotional abuse herself. Some sources even suggest that she too may have been forced to take part in Ogata Murders in some capacity. Her survival, however, wasn't due to Matsunaga and Junko's non-existent mercy. They kept her alive because, frankly, they needed her. After all, it was her who took care of the couple's 2 children, born in 1993 and 1996 respectively, and she did so while being subjected to extreme cruelty, despite her young age. Matsunaga forced her to drink alcohol while she was still in elementary school, and due to an oppressive schedule, attending school, taking care of 2 children, and constantly being abused in between, she was able to get only around 3 hours of sleep per night, leading to constant exhaustion and illness. Yet, remarkably, she never lost hope, and on January 30th, 2002, after more than 7 years in captivity, she finally attempted her first escape. On that day, she made it all the way to her grandparents' house in Kitakyūshū, where she stayed for nearly 2 weeks, slowly recovering from her nightmare and starting to plan her return to normal life. However, the guilt that Matsunaga had instilled in her over her involvement in her father's death kept her from revealing the full truth to her grandparents, and on February 14th, Matsunaga found out where she was. He kidnapped her, dragged her back to the Kokura apartment, and subjected her to weeks of severe punishment, including, of course, his signature method of electrocution. Once again, she found herself trapped in that nightmare of an apartment where escape seemed utterly impossible. But again, she refused to give up. After tasting freedom, she was able to work up the courage to make yet another daring escape on March 6, 2002. Once again, she ran straight to her grandparents' house, but this time she immediately told them everything that had happened. Her imprisonment, the torture, the tragic death of her father that her grandparents were allegedly completely unaware of at that point. They contacted the police, and the following day, on March 7, 2002, she led law enforcement directly to Matsunaga and Junko's apartment in Kokura, where the pair was then arrested and taken in for questioning. This time, the nightmare was truly over. Initially, the police believed that they were dealing with a single case of kidnapping and confinement involving Toraya Kumio's daughter. However, just days after her escape, she began revealing everything she had witnessed to the police, starting with her father's murder, then the atrocities committed against the Ogata family. It soon became clear that this wasn't just a kidnapping, but one of the most shocking mass murder cases Japan had ever seen. Both Matsunaga and Junko remained silent during the police questioning for months following their arrests. But suddenly, Junko decided to break her silence. Her confessions blew the case wide open, providing investigators with vital evidence. Receipts for materials used in the murders, the saw used to dismember Toraya Kumio, written statements that Matsunaga had forced his victims to sign. Combined with witness accounts from Toraya's daughter, Junko, and the couple's suspicious neighbors, the police now had everything they needed to finally put the couple behind bars. Believe it or not, for the longest time, Matsunaga actually believed that he could escape serious punishment, assuming that just because he had manipulated others into committing the murders, he would face minimal consequences. Thankfully, that is not how the Japanese legal system works, and on September 28, 2005, the Fukuoka District Court sentenced both Matsunaga Futoshi and Ogata Junko to death. As of early 2025, Matsunaga Futoshi remains on death row at the Fukuoka Detention Center, despite his numerous appeals. Junko's death sentence, on the other hand, was actually reduced to life in prison in 2007, as the court recognized that Matsunaga had coerced her into committing these crimes under constant threats of violence. Some might argue that in a way, life imprisonment is actually a harsher punishment than execution. But for Junko, that doesn't seem to be the case. According to her own statements, she is now finally able to enjoy the simple things in life, to eat, bathe, and read at her own leisure. Things she hadn't been able to do for over 2 decades, living under total control of Matsunaga. As for Toraya Kumio's daughter, despite the horrors she endured, she has reportedly rebuilt her life after extensive psychological treatment. Beyond that, details about her current life remain scarce, which is likely for the best. Relatives of the Ogata and Matsunaga families unrelated to the murders, as well as Kazuya's parents, have declined to speak publicly about the case, choosing instead to just move on from it all. In July of 2003, however, a memorial service was held for the 6 Ogata family members who lost their lives, giving them the funeral they deserved but never received. And finally, there's Matsunaga and Junko's 2 sons, now 32 and 28 years old. I'm happy to report that both of them seem to have managed to lead relatively normal lives. Notably, the eldest son runs a YouTube channel under the name Matsunaga Futoshi no Musuko, or the son of Matsunaga Futoshi, where he discusses a wide range of topics like the challenges he's faced and his experiences visiting his father on death row. After all the disturbing things we've learned about today, it's reassuring to see that not everyone who met Matsunaga had to meet a tragic end. But at the same time, it's terrifying to imagine how many more people might have suffered if Toraya's daughter hadn't been brave enough to escape. Matsunaga's ability to manipulate others, regardless of age or background, is both chilling and baffling. Even with the case solved and Matsunaga awaiting his execution, there's a lingering sense that we still don't fully understand how exactly he managed to wield such control over his victims. It almost feels like some crucial detail is missing, like an unsolved part of a cruel magic trick. Could it be that Matsunaga's manipulation was so deeply psychological that it defies logic? Or, as outlandish as it sounds, could he actually have possessed some sort of weird mind control ability? No, probably not. But let me know what you think in the comments down below. A special thank you goes out to all my Patreon supporters, including Bobby Wu, Javier Sodavia, Capybara Chuck, Turom, Daniel Dees, RK0, Sierran DC, White Gilden, Justin Down, Yoko the Space Whale, Steve Matsui, Cats in Soup, Jard B-Man, Ben Harradine, and Maddle Mama. And to the rest of you who stuck around until the end, thank you so much for watching. Sayonara.